It's Wednesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With more politicians being looked at for alleged betting on the election, how much deeper will the scandal go?
I think the public wants politicians to abide by the rules just as they have to.
I think we have to have a proper debate and a thoughtful debate about this rather than any knee-jerk reactions in terms of what we do more broadly going forward.
Hello, Bridgewater Surgeries, how can I help?
Labour promises to end the 8 a.m. scramble for GP appointments. Also, we'll discuss the growing sense of fear among politicians about violent attacks.
We all feel passionate about things. It's not an excuse for violence. It's not an excuse to tell someone you're going to kill them, or rape them, or kill their child.
And tonight, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the final televised debate of the election campaign. Joining us today, the former chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, Conservative Steve Brine, Labour's Deputy National Campaign Coordinator Ellie Reeves, the Deputy Leader of the Green Party, Zach Polansky, and the Editor-in-Chief of the news website Unheard, Freddie Sayers. This is Politics Live Election 2024. Welcome. Well, there are further developments, as you heard in the headlines, on the political gambling saga scandal over the past 24 hours. Let's have a look at some of the headlines, starting with the Financial Times. UK election betting scandal deepens as Labour suspends candidate, whom you can see there. If we look at The Guardian, election betting, fifth Tory investigated in growing scandal. Welsh politician Russell George told by Gambling Commission he is part of the inquiry. And then finally, the BBC Cabinet Minister Alistair Jack, you can see there, admits 3 election bets, 2 unsuccessful, 1 successful, he says, and says he's done nothing wrong. Well, let's talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. He joins us from Nottingham in the sunshine, where the BBC's head-to-head debate is taking place this evening between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Henry, it will probably feature, if not perhaps dominate, part of the discussion this evening. How much further is this scandal going to go?
I think it's a pretty solid bet that it's going to feature tonight, Jo, and I think it's a pretty solid bet that this story isn't over. I mean, it's 2 weeks ago today that we heard that Craig Williams, one specific Conservative candidate, had been under investigation by the Gambling Commission, which he very quickly admitted to. But I don't think anyone would have predicted that in the subsequent fortnight this story would grow and sprawl, really, in all the directions that it has. Because you've now got various different categories of allegations. You've got claims that people bet on a July election knowing that Rishi Sunak was going to call one. In other words, that they placed a bet on what they already knew was a dead cert. But then you've also got other claims that people bet on the outcome of contests in which they were involved. That's the Labour candidate, who Labour have now disowned. That's not quite the same, though, is it? Because ultimately it was up to the voters whether he wins that bet. I mean, he still won't find out until July the 4th. Then you've got claims about Alistair Jack, who's not a candidate, but he is still in the cabinet until after the general election. He's standing down from Parliament. So there's questions there. He insists that he did not have any inside information when he placed a bet actually a little while before Rishi Sunak called a July general election. It's messy, but the common theme is political actors betting on political outcomes. And I do wonder whether you'll see party leaders starting to suggest new rules for that sort of thing.
What about then the head-to-head itself? How important is it at this stage in the campaign with this swirling round?
I think it's a really big moment, Jo, because it is practically the last set-piece moment, at least for the 2 main party leaders, before polling day, which is a week tomorrow. And Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer clearly have different tasks to accomplish tonight. For Rishi Sunak, he needs to shake up this race in a way that he's failed to do at any point since he emerged into the Downing Street downpour and decided that there was going to be an election on July the 4th. He spent all that time trying to find a way to shake up the narrative, to try to get the public to look at the Conservatives again. And all the signs are that he's struggling to do so. I mean, I can tell you that's what the Conservative campaign believe. They do think they are behind as it stands. Tonight's one of the last opportunities for Rishi Sunak to shake that up. And then for Sir Keir Starmer, the inverse. It's really simple. He needs to not mess up. That's the task there for the leader of the Labour Party.
And just before you go, I'll show our viewers this headline, BBC News, man arrested over Westminster honeytrap case involving a number of politicians. Remind us what happened.
Well, how long have you got? I mean, it's
well,
a really
not long,
weak
actually, I was
case,
going to
but
say.
a couple
Can
of
you do
months-
it quite quickly?
I'll try. So a couple of months ago, it emerged that lots of people in Westminster had received messages from people masquerading as someone called Charlie or someone called Abby. In some cases, they became sexual. Some people, some ministers, in fact, shared compromising messages with whoever this person is. We don't know who this person is, but it appears the Met Police think they know who this person is. They arrested someone in Islington today on suspicion of offences both under the Online Safety Act and of harassment. All we know about that person is that they are in their mid-20s.
All right, Henry Zeffman, thank you very much. Enjoy today ahead of that head-to-head debate this evening. Let's go back to the issue about placing bets in terms of the election. In your mind, Steve, there are different categories here that we are talking about. Is this now a case of sort of a moral principle in terms of politicians and what they should and shouldn't do? Or has there been an overreaction?
A bit of both. I mean, if you ask anybody out there today, what are the Conservatives trying to land as their message of the day in the campaign, which is pressure on Rachel Reeves future tax rises, FYI, but I bet nobody else knows that because this is just dominating the landscape. So I've never placed a bet on myself to win, let alone lose an election.
Well, thank you for
I mean,
disclosure.
when I used to stand for elections, I kind of bet myself in my own mind to win every time, and it's peculiar to bet against yourself to lose. There may well be a case for the party leaders after the election and the new House of Commons to look at different rules around whether MPs should take part in election betting. I think probably Mel Stride's right that you should do that at leisure instead of at haste. It's all a bit unseemly, and frankly, you know, I think that the Labour Party today are a bit like the England football team, right? The top of the group, they're almost certainly progressing through to the next stage, and yet utterly unconvincing, and they haven't really shown any leg at all, so nobody knows what they'll do. And that's okay in the good times, right? It must be a dream to be Labour coordinator right now, because there's no scrutiny. But when you come up against, tough times, or Spain or Holland, then what happens? And that's where my analogy ends, Jo.
Yes, thank goodness for that. But they are, as you say, the top of the table. I mean, this is the England football team, not necessarily the Labour Party. Ellie, how do you judge this whole gambling issue in terms of bets being placed on timings of election or winning or losing contests?
Well, actually, for me, Jo, it's an issue of leadership. It took Rishi Sunak, I think, 13 days to suspend Conservative candidates who had placed these bets. That shows a weakness in leadership. When Keir Starmer discovered that one of the Labour candidates was under investigation by the Gambling Commission, he took very swift action and immediately suspended him. And that's the difference. So I think there's an issue around leadership here. It's really important that that rules are followed, and there are rules around gambling, and it's important that those rules are followed. There are investigations going on.
Well, there are clear rules about using information that you have had, privileged information, because that obviously then is no longer gambling. You know what the outcome of something is going to be, and placing a bet just randomly or not on something you don't have any prior information about.
You know, no one's saying that the MP shouldn't be able to have a flutter, but the issue here is about the rules and what's under investigation. And an investigation was launched into a Labour candidate, and Keir Starmer took swift action, in contrast to what the Prime Minister did.
Freddie?
We've just got to have some perspective here. I mean, we are 1 week ahead of a general election. We face huge issues as a country. The IFS says there is a conspiracy of silence between your two parties about future funding issues. And what are we talking about? We're talking about this tiny issue around gambling. It's very typical, actually, of the way our elections tend to take place. I mean, nobody is getting rich out of this. Nobody is throwing elections just to win a bob or two. And frankly, as we all know, working in politics has few pleasures. And if people want to have a flutter on these things, I think it should be fine. And so if we want to talk about corruption, if we want to talk about cronyism, let's talk about things like the £1.4 billion of PPE that the BBC uncovered is going to be destroyed, literally burnt, having been bought by the government in panic during the COVID crisis. That's what we should be talking about, not gambling.
Right. Get a bit of perspective.
Well, I think these things are important. And actually, you talked about PPE and the fact that there are allegations against a number of Conservative staffers, candidates in relation to betting. I think the public think, well, is this another example, again, of one rule for them and one for everyone else? And the fact that it did take Rishi Sunak so long to take action does make it look like that.
All right, Zach, just before I come to you, I just want to play this because Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, has been asked. We've had disclosure from you, Steve. Have you ever placed a bet on election outcome?
No.
Right, just to check. You, Zach? No. OK, well, we've cleared that up. Let's just have a listen to Ed Davey.
So you placed a bet on the outcome of the 2010 election?
Well, I said that I thought we were going to do better as a party. I thought the Liberal Democrats were going to gain more seats. I was quite excited. I don't usually bet, but I bet on that occasion, and I lost.
Where are you? Where do you think the moral outrage, rightly or wrongly, should be? Or is it a case of more perspective, as Freddie says?
I think there's a little bit of truth in all of this, and it comes back to this case of there's different groups of allegations. I think if someone clearly knew the date and they have betted, that is a huge, serious problem. And I think it's a problem that is in line with the PPE allegations. It's a problem in line with Partygate. It's a problem in line with that general sense from the public that politicians are in it for themselves, that they don't trust politicians. And actually, frankly, it smears all of us when people behave like this. So I do agree with Ellie. I think it's about leadership, but not just leadership from the top of the parties, but actually every single representative taking responsibility for their actions, how they behave. And I think some of these candidates have been found sorely lacking.
Right, and if that was the case with a Green candidate, you would want them suspended immediately then?
Well, I think that's a conversation about exactly what they've done and the round of allegation. But if a Green candidate did know when the general election was, then yes, they should be gone.
Well, that, of course, is clearer in terms of insider.
The thing I would just add about the Prime Minister is that, there were allegations made, and if there's improper behaviour that is contrary to the law, then that's being looked at rightly. That's not for us to discuss a TV programme. The Prime Minister's done a very quick internal investigation by the sounds of it, which has allowed him to then to suspend the candidates. Keir Starmer seems to have just sort of rushed to judgment and chopped somebody. I'm glad he's not my lawyer, quite frankly, because I thought we had due process in this country. And, the Prime Minister's maybe shown himself to be prime ministerial and showing a little bit of judgment, a little bit of poise, a little bit of calm, and showing a little bit of perspective. Well, in which case, hopefully, we'll talk about some issues.
Well, and here we are. Let's get to them. The front page of The Mirror, ahead of the election campaign. Labour pledge on doctors will end 8 a.m. GP scramble. I'm sure lots of our viewers have experienced difficulties, let's put it that way, with trying to get GP appointments. Let's talk to Professor Camilla Hawthorne, Chair of the Royal College of GPs. Camilla, welcome to you. First of all, it seems to have become emblematic, in a way, of what critics would generally say is broken Britain. You can't get a GP appointment. Is that how you see it too?
Good afternoon, first of all, Jo. Yes, I think that it's a real problem, and we're just as frustrated and upset about this as our patients are. We're there to give a service. We've been trained for many years. We're anxious to give a high quality service, and it's becoming really difficult. Certainly in my practice, we keep changing our appointment systems because we keep trying to increase the capacity, but the demand is always greater than the capacity. That's the problem.
Right. While we're chatting, we're going to show some pictures of the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, and Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary. They're on a visit at a GP surgery in Derbyshire. But you've described, you say you're frustrated too. Why is it then that GP practices and surgeries vary so much from one to another? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any consistency.
So GP practices are all independent organisations. They're independent contractors, and they run their practices in their own way. And of course, they serve different communities. So some will be in a very dispersed area in a rural community, some will be in an inner city deprived area, some will be in the leafy suburbs. And so they can adapt their services to the communities they serve. But we have been working a lot harder overall than we've ever done before. We're providing well over 1 million appointments a day in England. And in fact, since the last, I suppose, 2018, 30 to 50 million more appointments a year with fewer GPs, because GPs are leaving the profession faster than they're entering it. So we're about 880 short of where we were a few years ago. And of course, we're dealing with patients who, as a community, are ageing with more complex chronic problems.
Right, just before I open it up to our guests here, on that note, a recent survey by the British Medical Association showed that more than 4 in 5 locum GPs in England are unable to find work, with a third forced to leave the NHS because they can't make ends meet. How does that stack up with what you've just said, is there aren't enough doctors?
So this aren't enough GPs. GPs. This is a real paradox, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's happened quite suddenly about 6 to 8 months ago. Before that, you just weren't enough GPs at all. And GPs were very much in demand. Now, all of a sudden, we've discovered that practices are finding it really financially impossible to employ as many GPs as they need for their patients. And that's due to years and years of underfunding and under-resourcing of practices. That has just gradually been getting worse and worse till we've got to a point now where I have a number of GP partners who are telling me that they're taking home less than their salaried GPs and they cannot afford to employ any more. So we're now looking at a possible several hundred, maybe more, GPs out of work come the summer.
Right. I mean, Steve, listening to that, I mean, you were, as we said at the beginning, chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee. You must have looked at these issues. I mean, is it rocket science to solve this problem of people struggling to get GP appointments?
If it was simple, then it would have been solved.
Okay.
The reason there is great variation is because it's called the National Health Service, but of course it's not. It's a series of regional health services. And as Camilla, rightly says, the general practice exists under contract to the NHS. It's not part of the NHS. So that's why there's variation. I mean, I'm glad that Labour are talking about this today. Yeah. This is a really important issue to some people. I think Wes, who I have a lot of time, a lot of respect for, I think Wes is wrong to say that general practice is near collapse. I think that's dangerous. It's quite frightening. I had a very good experience with my GP in London last week when I had tonsillitis. I had a very good experience the very same day when my son had tonsillitis, where we got, very quick same day care. The government, to its credit, have announced its primary care recovery plan, which talks about patient access through the NHS app, for instance. It talks about modern telephony so that people don't get the engaged tone, so that they get callbacks, they know where they are in the queue. That is being rolled out, but it's too slow. The bit about building capacity in general practice, I mean, I take responsibility for the things that I didn't do well in government, but actually I did do the forerunner that is now called Pharmacy First, and I think that has been a big success. And both parties have building on the success of Pharmacy First in their manifesto, and that's really important because what that's about is taking the wider primary care team and helping patients get what they need, because you don't always need, underlined, to see a GP. Very often you need to see a pharmacist. That's what I saw on Friday, and it did the job for me.
Yeah, and we've talked about it, but we heard there from Professor Camilla Hawthorne, underfunding. Are you going to put more funding into GP practices? I know that they are private entities in that sense. Are you going to put more funding?
Well, look, can I just start by responding to something that Steve said, which is about this is an important issue to some people. I have dealt with a huge amount of casework over the years from people unable to get GP appointments. I was speaking to a constituent recently who every day on their way to work to the station, they walk past their GP surgery and they see a queue of people round the block, and they told me they're terrified of getting ill because they know if they do, it will be incredibly difficult for them to get an appointment. So I think it's a really big issue and we shouldn't downplay it.
No one's downplaying it, but it's not everybody, Ellie. Some people and many people have very good experiences of their general practice, and I think this is a profession that is working really hard, that does a very good job for a lot of people, and I don't think we should just run it down on television and say that it's all a disaster and it's all part of broken Britain. There are very good parts of general practice that are doing a good job for your former constituents and my former constituents.
I think there are some fantastic doctors. The problem is people can't get appointments to see them.
Can I say I think the answer is yes. This is about underfunding, and actually there is a conspiracy of silence between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. They both recognise that the NHS and more widely is in crisis, but they're not putting the sums of money, not even nearly, that is needed. And we're hearing that from the Nuffield Trust, I'm hearing that from the BMA, we're hearing it from everyone. And actually,
so what would the Greens
be
the Green
Party are really clear.
Investment?
We need about £50 to £70 billion for the National Health Service. Now, that's a big sum of money because it's a big problem. But as a politician, the Green Party are going to be straight with people about that. We could have a wealth tax taxing multimillionaires and billionaires, just 1% on assets of over £10 million or more, or 2% on assets of £1 billion £1,000 or more, along with other tax, like bringing in capital gains tax in line with income tax. So we're taxing unearned wealth as much as earned wealth. It's these kind of measures that ultimately need to go. Because, yes, it's not just a funding problem, but until you have the funding and until you have the capacity, you can move everything that you want, but it's not going to work. And by the way, I said this to Wes Streeting yesterday, and I accused him of privatising the NHS. He said the left were bleating on again. Our NHS needs to stay free at the point of use.
Yeah, but who's saying it shouldn't?
The Labour Party, they're saying they will open their arms to privatisation.
Hang on. Who is saying? They haven't said that.
Wes Streeting has said they will open their arms to privatisation, warmly open the doors to privatisation.
But that is not what they've said is more private sector involvement, which has been there for quite some time. That is different, but that is different to charging people accessing.
Yeah, for sure, but it's a route to it. So the PFI contract,
it's a route to it.
£2 billion. On PFI,
the Labour Party set up the NHS, and the principle of it being free at the point of use is something that's fundamental to the Labour Party. We want people to be able to get GP appointments, which is why we would train 6,000 more GPs. We would end the 8 a.m. scramble by updating the app so people can book appointments online and change their appointments online.
And you think we should change it?
Well, what we have here is a kind of quadratic equation that can't be solved with those parameters, right? The Labour Party has said they're not going to do massive tax rises, they're not going to spend a huge amount more. They're talking a lot about reform, but they're not really talking about what that is. Jo, you mentioned free at the point of use. That's something that maybe should be discussed. It's this sacred cow in the UK. I'm almost hiding under the table before mentioning it, but I'm half Swedish. Sweden is a welfare state country. It has a higher tax take than we do. The health system is incredible. I've just been there and I can tell you it's paradise compared to what we have. And what they do is they charge a very small amount for people to visit a GP, around £20, and there's special provision made for people who really can't afford it. And you know what? It cuts out a lot of time wasters and it helps the system. Those kind of outside-the-box ideas is what we need to really think about if we're going to solve this problem.
Is there political support for that?
No, they're not out-of-the-box ideas. They're dangerous ideas that would restrict access to primary care for some of the most vulnerable people who have got comorbidities, who need to be able to see their doctor or a primary care professional without worrying about what it's going to cost them. I would just caution against the simplicity here. Labour talking today about bringing back the family doctor. Did it ever go away? For many young people, they don't want the family doctor. They don't want to see the same person every time. They're perfectly happy with telemedicine. We must get away from these simplistic answers. And the other thing is, this stuff today about locums, the locum story and the family doctor story are obviously completely linked, because if you want a continuity of care, which the Health Select Committee said in its general practice report was very important, and you have better outcomes for over 75s who have continuity of care between the same GP, then you need more salaried GPs. You don't need more locum GPs who may be there one day and maybe not there the next.
Right. Ellie?
Well, I think this issue around the family doctor and being able to get face-to-face appointments. Well, people that want a face-to-face appointment should be able to get one. And I appreciate not everyone does want a face.
Yeah.
And that's fine. They can have a telephone appointment, but a lot of people do want that face-to-face appointment. But also the thing about the family doctor, seeing the same doctor, is actually really helpful if someone's got complex health needs, not having to go through all of their medical history every time they go to the GP. And that's been lost.
That's going to cost money that is not showing up in your spending plans. I mean, that's the big mystery here. You're talking about additional appointments, bringing back the family doctor, saving the NHS. That phrase has come up again, and yet there's no indication of where you're going to get the money from.
And what I mean by simplicity is simplistic answers. The Liberal Democrats are talking about this guaranteed right to see a GP within, I think it's 24 hours or something. That is just utter nonsense, right? Because there are many times when you don't need to see a GP. Other primary care professionals will more than suffice.
Would you say pharmacies are equipped to deal with it? Because they're already dealing themselves with quite a lot of
pharmacists are medicine professionals.
Sure.
Right? And they are highly trained primary care professionals.
Oh, I'm not
and
saying they're not
said
capable.
That we trust them to do these 7 common conditions, from sore throat to impetigo. And the Conservative manifesto talks about increasing the number of these conditions, and I think the Labour Party would do the same. There's a 20-fold increase in the spend on primary care that the government are promising in its manifesto, and that on Pharmacy First. That has to be right. That's about using the wider capacity in primary care. But there's no replacement for an actual GP for people who have comorbidities and need that continuity of care, because, as Ellie says, they see you come in and they remember when Dad had X and Dad started presenting with Y, and they then can join the dots on your family care. That's what a family doctor
Let me just get a final word from Camilla Hawthorne. I mean, Camilla, do you think it's going to improve. Whoever wins the election, do you think the situation is going to radically transform?
It won't transform overnight. It's encouraging to hear people redirecting billions of pounds into primary care. And we know it's a more cost-effective way of preventing people from needing to be admitted to hospital where care is expensive and at the moment is overwhelmed. I do worry. I think if you look at other systems, and the King's Fund has been looking at this, really our system is no worse than other systems. It's just under-resourced. That's the problem. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I would say as well that, you know, in general practice, we're seeing 360 million plus cases a year in a population of 60 million. So if you do the sums, that's 6 appointments per person per year. Some people are taking more, some people are taking less. We clearly need more. We've got an aging, sicker population. So we clearly need more, and we need to be working not just on recruiting these fabulous 6,000 additional GPs who haven't appeared and were promised some years ago, but also retaining them. How do we keep people in practice?
Professor Hawthorne, thank you very much for joining us for that discussion. Now, we have, of course, Zach Polanski here, Deputy Leader of the Green Party. And Zach, you may have heard the leading think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, accusing smaller parties, including the Greens, of using their proposals, you outlined some of them in terms of the funding for the NHS that you would support in higher taxes across the board. But Paul Johnson, who is the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, said that your proposals are poisoning the political debate. Let's have a listen.
I want to spend a little time, though, on Reform UK and the Greens. They offer much bigger numbers, very exciting, radical policies. Of course, they're not going to be implemented because they're not going to form the government. But I would suggest that the way that they suggest that their radical reforms can realistically make a positive difference, when in fact what they propose is wholly unattainable, does help to actually to poison the political debate.
Well, that's quite an accusation. Do you agree, first of all, that your proposals are wholly unattainable?
No, I don't, surprisingly. I also think it's absurd to put Reform and Greens in the same place.
Well,
Reform's are anti-migrant, anti-net zero, and Greens are the opposite of all.
Let's focus on what you are proposing, because he was very specific, proposes an extra, in the rest of his speech, an extra £145 billion in day-to-day spending compared to £5 billion for Labour, £17 billion on tax cuts from the Conservatives. It is wholly unattainable.
Well, actually, BBC Verify said that our economic manifesto is economically credible, and also we've worked with the Wealth Tax Commission and University of Greenwich on their modelling. But more widely, I think, if you look at the Office of Budget Responsibility, a few years ago they did a report around the climate crisis, and actually a lot of the solutions they were suggesting around the taxation we're asking for, and crucially the borrowing, is very similar to our plans. Ultimately, this is about what is the level of ambition. And if you borrow to pay for unfunded tax cuts like Liz Truss did, that will crash the economy. But if you borrow for capital investment to get our country moving and ultimately invest in the future of tackling the climate crisis and getting an economy moving, then that's exactly the right way to go. That's real hope and real change, and that's what the Green Party is offering.
I've got to say what Paul Johnson there says, to me, is the worst of kind of policing the Overton window. If anything poisons the political debate, it's kind of pouring scorn on smaller parties who are actually having some interesting ideas. Now, I'm not going to say that the Green Party manifesto stacks up economically, nor reform, but at least there's some interest there. And frankly, in this very kind of uninteresting general election, some of the ideas that are actually worth paying attention to are coming from Reform and from the Greens. And I think that makes it a more healthy debate. So for him to stand there and basically insist on orthodoxy, which is what his role seems to be, we've tried that for decades, it hasn't worked.
Right, Steve, is it poisoning the political debate, the sort of proposals that we've heard from Zach?
Well, I mean, what they're doing, of course, is framing the choice between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, because, you know, they're the only two that are going to enter Downing Street next Friday morning. So there's that. I mean, I haven't read, your manifesto in great detail, but I do think we should call out some of the stuff in the smaller manifestos. I mean, you know, we've got a climate emergency. Look at it out there. Look, the dangers that we've got in the Med right now, and we've got the leader of a mainstream political party who is polling some way just behind the Conservatives right now, saying that we should end net zero nonsense. We should crack down even tougher on immigration when we've got 152,000 vacancies in the care system. I don't get the joke with Nigel Farage. I call it out. I don't think it's funny. The man in the pub routine doesn't
he's
make
not
me
here,
laugh.
but yeah.
And you know, if he's here, he'd say, "Oh, well, of course, that's because, you know, Mr. Bryan doesn't get the new politics." You know what? I don't get his new politics, and I don't want it. And we, as the main party, should call it out, because that poisons politics.
I think that's right, Steve. I think it's also important to say Reform have 8 councillors.
Well,
the Green
as I
Party
say,
have 850.
They're not
Well,
here,
there you go.
and you are.
No,
Let's focus on the Green. Yeah, we are. But let's focus on you and your position. In fact, we can show the general election voting intention for the Greens, unlike Reform, which has definitely increased in terms of people's voting intentions. Yours has been pretty static at 6%. Why?
Yes, so we've quadrupled our number of local councillors in the last 4 years, but in a general election, a first-past-the-post system is undoubtedly more difficult for us. However, we target
But the support's gone up for Reform. It's stayed the same for Greens.
Well, we target seats like Bristol, Brighton, North Herefordshire and Waveney Valley. This is places where we think we can get Green MPs. It's really clear that the Conservatives are toast. We will have a Labour government, but having Green MPs there will push that Labour government to be bigger, better and bolder. For instance, tomorrow, Carla Denyer, the co-leader of the Greens, will be out with the junior doctors on strike on the picket line. Ellie, will you join them?
Well, I wouldn't promote that, Zach. That's
well,
not
I think
that's
it's
not a
important
good
that
thing.
people get pay
that's
restoration.
Not a good thing.
And I think
well,
most
let's just
people would
remind people
stand
what
with
that is. 35% pay restoration.
Yeah.
And you'd fund that how?
So this is going to be both from borrowing and also from the taxes I was talking about, making sure those with the broadest shoulders.
Borrowing and taxes. Steve's got his head in his hands.
Yeah.
Ellie, what about you?
I mean, I've looked at the last page of the Green Party manifesto where it sets out costings, and I think that under that it's something like £82 billion worth of additional debt.
It's not far off what Jeremy Corbyn's Labour manifesto would have cost in 2019.
But also it's a lot less than Austria and France.
In that Liz Truss mini budget that crashed the economy, sent people's mortgages spiralling, I think there was something like 40 billion of additional debt. So, you know, these proposals, you know, over 80 billion additional debt would just absolutely crash our economy.
But your health spokesman, Wes Streeting, has said to the BMA, as regards junior doctor strikes, that he'll be on the phone on day one.
Yes.
Is what he said. What do you think they will receive that as a message? Of course, they're expecting a big pay rise. As soon as finally, after 14 years, they're going to get a Labour government.
Should they get one? Wes has also said that he doesn't think these strikes should go ahead. He doesn't think that, you know, the current government is going to resolve it. And yes, one of the first calls that he would make on the 5th of July is that if he's lucky enough, if we are lucky enough to form a government,
he's going to talk
about get round the table, because that's how you
get round the table. Let's leave that. Let's just assume they're all round the table. What's the figure going to be? I mean, he's got to talk about money.
You know that I'm not going to carry out negotiations on TV, but getting round the table, having those conversations.
Yeah, but Zach, you're a pressure group in that sense, aren't you? You're a pressure group on this issue, aren't you? You're just going to try and pressurise if Labour wins the election.
Greens in Parliament, and in fact, Ellie could go and join those junior doctors on the picket line, but is refusing that. Right. But I think the important point here is the pandemic. We saw multimillionaires and billionaires get richer than they ever have, whilst our junior doctors and people in the NHS were out there working every single day. Well, of course they should be paid properly. I mean, the fact we're even having this conversation is that orthodoxy. A proper wage compared to...
define proper wage.
By taxing multimillionaires and billionaires to make sure that those people running our country are paid properly. And when you say that's ridiculous, you put your head in your hands. 14 years of Conservative austerity.
The reason my head is in my hands is because they want 35%. The government have said that's unaffordable, where Streeting has rightly said that is unaffordable. The government have offered...
It's pay restoration, though.
The government
have had a pay cut over those.
The government have offered 9% plus 3%, so that's 12%. So somewhere between 12 and 35 is where the deal lies, right? So if you're picking up the phone on day one, what's your gambit? Where do you start from? Because it's somewhere between 12 and 35. Anything over 12 costs more than is currently in the
But the Conservatives have obviously failed completely to resolve these strikes.
Yep, and I don't think that the BMA Junior Doctors Committee has any intention of settling with a Conservative government. They have settled with an SNP government and a Labour government in Wales.
At least we're getting a policy. He says wants to raise taxes and pay them a lot more.
But hang on,
it's coherent.
Right.
So neither of these parties, and particularly the Labour Party, which we're expecting to lead, are admitting, what are you going to do? There's nothing in the manifesto to pay doctors more. You're saying you're not going to borrow more. You're not going to raise taxes. How are you going to do it?
Right. Can I just come... Yeah, well, how are you going to do it?
But last time Labour were in government, we didn't see the strikes like we've seen at the moment.
Yeah, but you are going to have to resolve this one.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm confident that Wes Streeting will be able to do that if we're privileged enough to form a government.
But it's going to cost him money.
But there's no complacency as well about the outcome of this election either.
Right. I mean, you say, Zach, just briefly, the money will be raised by taxing, in particular, the rich. Who do you count as the rich?
So before I was saying assets of over £10 million or more, 1%.
Not your policies in the manifesto.
National insurance. So we're also talking about people earning over £55,000 a year, giving £5 a week.
That makes you rich.
We have to talk about what that's offset by. That's offset by cheaper public transport, not having to use privatised healthcare, making sure there's a council house available. Ultimately, this isn't just about the tax. It's about
some teachers and police sergeants could pay £300 or more extra in tax.
When I talk to people, £5 a week, those same people would be very happy to do that if it meant that we had public services that ran properly. There's a sense this country is broken. It's these two parties who have broken it together in this orthodoxy, and the Green Party are offering real hope and real change.
Do you think that will be attractive in terms of raising taxes?
I think the reason the reform line has been inching upwards on the chart we just saw on the screen and the green line has been remaining flat is that people don't really like the idea of massive new tax hikes.
I don't think £5 a week is a massive new tax hike.
Right, I'm just going to show you the proxy vote registration deadline here. 5 p.m. today, not long to register to vote by proxy, and you must also be registered to vote. So make sure you gallop down and get that all sorted out before 5 o'clock this afternoon. Just briefly, do you think leadership is important when it comes to setting the tone and example to and on green policies?
Yeah, I think it's very important.
So why is it that Carla Denyer, the co-leader, has said that she's still got her gas boiler, but she's got quotes for a heat pump in her email inbox? Lots of people out there were saying, well, if she can't be bothered to actually install a heat pump and get rid of her gas boiler, why should we?
Can she not be bothered, or is it about affordability and is it about capacity in someone to actually install it? This isn't about individuals. This is about systemic change, and that needs to come from big business and ultimately from government legislating.
So leadership, you don't need to lead by example.
You can do both. So I have the power and privilege that I don't drive, I'm vegan and I don't fly, but ultimately those are individual choices I've made because I can afford them and because I have the space to do them. That's not what the Green Party is about. You can eat meat, you can drive and you can fly. This is about ultimately saying we need that system change, and ultimately the greenest, cleanest option should always be the cheapest. It's really important that people don't think this is about individual responsibility. This is about systemic change.
Careful what you wish for, because you look across Europe and those kind of policies have just become incredibly unpopular. It's leading to revolts. People are making protests on the streets. We've seen this huge backlash in the European elections, and actually green policies trying to force people to spend money they don't feel they have on top-down measures that they're not sure are going to be effective is proving incredibly unpopular. So careful what you wish for.
So where I agree is we're experiencing wildfires and floods, and these shouldn't be top-down measures. They should be measures made with communities, and I agree we've all got to get better at that.
All right, let's have a look at this headline. BBC News, Braverman, that's Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, still has 24/7 security due to threats. There is a documentary, BBC Radio 4's The Deadly Business of Democracy. It's now available to listen to on BBC Sounds. Let's have a listen to a couple of the clips. One of them is from Suella Braverman and another from the Labour politician Naz Shah.
We all feel passionate about things. It's not an excuse for violence. It's not an excuse to tell someone you're going to kill them or rape them or kill their child.
My eldest, she was only 13 at the time when I got my first ever death threat. The police rang me up and said, "Oh, where are you? We've just intercepted a threat to shoot you." And at that point, I did sit my daughter down, saying, "Look, if anything happens to me, you remember your mother was doing the right thing." Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's not a conversation you should have with a 13-year-old.
Do you recognise those sorts of threats? I mean, they're awful. I mean, is this common? That level of threat? I know abuse generally, but that level of threat against MPs?
I mean, I've heard a number of stories of MPs facing the sorts of threats that Naz has spoken about that. And, I don't think we should forget that two much-loved MPs have been murdered in recent years, loved by both sides of the House. It's a very real issue.
Steve?
Yeah, don't separate out abuse from threats that become other things. I would just say that
Fair enough.
I took a zero tolerance, old habits die hard, took a zero tolerance approach. I always remember when I was first elected, there was this chap who would email me with the most rude, vile, abusive emails. And I used to call him the Wizard of Oz because I saw him at an event and he was this very tiny, frail old man. But when he got behind his email, he used to send me these abusive emails and he was so terribly charming to me in person. But I took a zero tolerance approach to replies to him because I thought thought, well, you have to call this out, because if you let it be okay in the virtual world, then eventually it spills over. And, you know, it's vile, and it isn't just women. There are plenty of men that get it too. And, you know, I'm not going to give the credibility to people, even in a place like Winchester. I had multiple threats over the years. I'm not going to give the credibility to describing them, because they don't deserve that. But, you know, we do this job because we all have disagreements on how, but we all believe in the greater good. And the challenge is, do you know what, Jo, is that a lot of people, my school friends, they would think I was bonkers to do this. And a lot of sensible people wouldn't dream of going anywhere near this, because they hear about this. And good for Carolyn Quinn, who's a quality journalist, who's doing this work for the BBC, and listen to her documentary.
How seriously do you take the issue of personal safety? I mean, is it a daily thing that you're considering, taking all sorts of steps to mitigate?
You know, as you know, Ellie, you know, for those of us on the back benches, you know, if you're in one of the great offices of state, of course, you have protection officers around you. It was never being in Westminster that concerned me, because we were surrounded by a ring of steel and men with semi-automatic machine guns. It was when I was out and about in the constituency that it concerned me. We don't have that protection.
I think it's really important with this to try to retain that atmosphere that MPs are accessible. And unlike in a lot of other countries where they are surrounded by security people, they're distant celebrities who you can never get access to, it's quite special in this country that our representatives are kind of in amongst the community. They often have close relationships. So I think it'd be a real mistake to try and react to this by just upping the security only. We should try, I think you're exactly right, party leaders, particularly when their supporters are going against people they don't like. You know, party leaders should call out if Suella Braverman, for example, is receiving abuse from Green Party activists or from Labour Party activists. It's really important that you call them out and say, this is not cool, it's not OK. That's a better route to fixing this than just upping
and moderate our language. You know, in the new Parliament, temperatures will rise, philosophically, politically and climate. And, you know, I remember John McDonnell, who is, you know, a candidate in this election, who called on people to go and lynch Esther McVey in her constituency.
Language is important.
Language
is important. What about you? Because you're on the London Assembly. Have you experienced that level of threat and the abuse? I take your point, Steve, it shouldn't be minimised.
I daily experience anti-Semitism and homophobia. And also solidarity to the MPs or former MPs. Like, it's not acceptable for anyone to receive abuse. I do have a lot of sympathy with Freddie's argument. I think we can't just shut down democracy, but clearly people at work need to feel safe. So we've got to find this balance. I've had the experience in the Assembly where I work frequently with London Mayor Sadiq Khan, and we did lots of public events together. Those have been shut down over the last year, and we've been doing them remotely. I think that's bad for democracy, but I'm not going to talk about someone's security on TV, but it's about making sure that someone is both secure, but also you're able to do that democratic piece. We've got to get that balance right.
Right, and what about the tension, though, between, as you say, there are protests that go on outside MPs, or now former MPs' homes on important issues, but does that cross the line?
I think being outside a home is never acceptable. I think being out a constituency office is very different. I think, obviously, the tone of how you protest is obviously also important. But I'd make a wider point too, that we've got some really serious issues going on in the world. And I think people need to be able to protest, but they need to do it in a respectful way that doesn't make anyone feel threatened or intimidated.
Right. I mean, just to look at this in The Independent, 4 arrests at Rishi Sunak's house after man filmed leaving parting gift dirty protest in his lake. I mean, Ellie?
Totally unacceptable. There shouldn't be protests outside MPs' homes, things left at MPs' homes. That shouldn't have any place in our democracy. By all means, lobby your member of Parliament. Most MPs, I'd like to think, are pretty accessible to the public. I'm certainly out and about in my constituency, but MPs' homes should be completely off limits.
Right, and do you agree with that, Steve?
100%, yeah. I mean, we all have changed our behaviour over the years. When I look back to when I started 14, 17 years ago as a candidate, you know, I would advertise I was going to be in Winchester High Street on a Saturday morning 2 weeks out and then be there. I would never have dreamed of doing that if I was standing at this election. Just couldn't. And the police have probably advised me against it.
It's all we have time for, but thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. But from all of us, have a very good afternoon. Bye.